How do Americans view the Middle East? Some may see the region in whole as unstable and still recovering from the grips of ISIS. Others may see a land rich in history and culture that holds promise. However you view it, the Middle East and Arab world is home to hundreds of millions of people, all hailing from diverse backgrounds with different stories to share.
In general, stereotypes in the Western world, I would say, include that Arab women are oppressed or meek, or sometimes they're viewed as questionable, not to be trusted, they're exoticized, they're the subject of the Western gaze.
That's Zahra Hankir, a journalist and author of Our Women on the Ground, essays by Arab women reporting from the Arab world. The book compiles the essays of 19 fearless Arab and Middle Eastern female journalists who come from Syria, Iraq, Libya, and several other countries. Some work for established media outlets, and others are freelance or local citizen journalists.
Women in the Arab world are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly fearless. They are facing these challenges, but they will rise above them to continue telling the nuanced and intricate stories of what's happening in their societies, oftentimes writing about women who themselves are, of course, resilient. And that's the full story. You really cannot get the full story of a conflict unless you're hearing stories from women that are being written by women.
Each of the essays by these 19 women offer a candid look into their everyday lives and some of the barriers they face as female reporters.
And I think the bottom line actually is that they're viewed as oppressed. And I think essentially what these women in the book do through their work is they do definitely discuss or describe the way in which they endure some of that oppression and misogyny and patriarchy. But what they're preoccupied with is the importance of the work they're doing and the resilience required to do that work.
Hope, courage, and persistence are all traits central to these female journalists as they face steep challenges while reporting in some of these regions. Hankir recounts her own childhood and how important journalists and the flow of news was to her own Lebanese family separated by war.
It's interesting because I actually returned to Lebanon when I was 12 years old, but I grew up in the UK understanding very profoundly that we were not able to return to the country because there was a war there. News was a permanent fixture in our household, whereby the TV would always be on. My parents were always watching what was happening in our homeland, and journalists were almost like, they were crucial for my parents because they were their connection to Lebanon at a time when they couldn't call their families because landlines were often down, there was no such thing as the internet, and they weren't able to at least get the assurance that their family was safe, so they would follow the news obsessively, really. And that's how I grew up, where news was a portal for me.
This reliance on news bridged two separate worlds for Hankir. And as she grew up, the power of storytelling became central to her career as a Lebanese-British freelance journalist.
I continually struggled with that idea as I grew up because I knew I was from somewhere else and I was connected to that place, but I didn't really get to know it until we returned after the Civil War. My family returned in the 90s when the Civil War subsided. And that's really when my love for news and passion for news deepened because the country was still mired in instability. And my passion for news just grew and grew and culminated, I would say, in this project.
In the introduction of the book, Hankir details the story of a young Syrian woman named Ruqayya Hassan, who understood the importance of sharing what she was seeing.
She's an incredibly fierce and fearless Syrian Kurdish woman who wrote as a citizen journalist and blogger from her home in Raqqa in Syria at a time when ISIS was controlling Raqqa. And I was drawn to her posts for several reasons. She would write about what she was observing, so some of it you could consider newsy. She'd write updates on what was happening around her and things she was hearing, and then she would also reflect on what she was seeing and feeling at the time. So her posts were almost poetic, but they were also very informative. I also wanted to highlight her story because she was able to access certain spaces, for example, or tell certain stories that a Western journalist couldn't at the time, simply because they weren't allowed access into those places. And news organizations were not at the time sending Western journalists to particularly unstable or violent places in Syria.
At the height of ISIS in Syria, it was extremely dangerous to be an outspoken Arab woman who wore makeup and spoke freely on social media. Knowing the potential consequences of her actions, Hassan persisted and continued to report on the atrocities happening in the city.
I was amazed by her bravery because although she wrote under a pseudonym, her pictures of herself were all her. She used pictures without concealing at all her identity, and her pictures just exuded a certain strength and fearlessness. And she ultimately pays for that work that she did, the immense risks that she took. She pays for those risks with her life, basically.
Hassan was abducted and executed by ISIS in 2015. And her story of resilience, Hankir says, is not uncommon. Women throughout the Middle East express defiance through sometimes the simplest of acts.
Amira al-Sharif, a photojournalist in Yemen, says, as she photographed a home that had been completely destroyed by bombing from Saudi forces, she says, you can destroy our homes, but we're still going to do laundry. You know, the picture is actually in the book. There's clothing just strung up on a clothing line just outside of a demolished home. And I just find those little moments of life continuing on despite the harrowing circumstances around these women to be incredibly moving.
Hankir says these essays in the book also showcase the oddities of trying to find some sense of normalcy while living in a war-torn region.
These women are doing this work, but they're wanting to continue living their lives in the same way that you would live your life anywhere else. You know, there's a very harrowing passage in an essay by Syrian journalist Zahra Hankir in which she says her car was parked next to a school that had just been bombed, and there was blood on her car, and she's wiping the blood off the car as she calls her friend and says, "What are we going to have for lunch today?" That little anecdote really knocked me sideways because it shows you the extent to which, people need to continue living their lives.
Despite the dangers, the threats, and the stereotypes, people persist. Hankir hopes the essays found in this book can break some of the stereotypes associated with the Middle East and offer a glimpse into the diverse perspectives coming out of the region.
There is no one story or conflict that encompasses the entire region of hundreds of millions of people, and therefore the people of that region are incredibly diverse and the women are incredibly diverse, and every single story in this book brings light to that. It shows the extent to which the conflicts vary, the people vary, the cultures vary, the challenges can in some cases be similar, but they also vary themselves as well. So I'm hoping that when someone picks up this book and reads it, any ideas or preconceived notions that they have on the region, which are deeply rooted in flawed post-colonial narratives, I would say, on the Arab world, are dented or disrupted or punctured by what they're reading, and also that they will respect local journalists and local journalism on a different level and really learn that the women who are doing this work are facing a very steep and unique set of challenges, and we should be reading their stories in the same way that we read the stories of other people who go to these regions and then write memoirs when they return home.
To find out more about journalist and author Zahra Hankir and the book Our Women on the Ground, Essays by Arab Women Reporting from the Arab World, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also check out our website to learn more about the recently released documentary called For Sama, a fantastic film about one woman living life and trying to survive in war-torn Aleppo, Syria. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter @ViewpointsRadio, and subscribe and listen to our show anytime wherever you listen to podcasts. This segment is written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
It's back-to-school season, and classrooms often don't come with everything teachers need. The average public school teacher spends $500 each year out of their own pocket for learning materials. One nonprofit is working to change that. DonorsChoose.org founder Charles Best.
My students and I started DonorsChoose.org because we thought people would want to help teachers if they only knew what we needed and could see how their donation would be used.
DonorsChoose.org enables teachers to request classroom resources ranging from books to pencils to field trips. Donors can browse through projects and give to the ones that inspire them. Supplies are shipped directly to the school, and donors receive thank yous from the classroom. Amanda Lennox Hall teaches 3rd grade in Austin, Texas.
DonorsChoose.org has had a tremendous impact on my classroom. We've diversified our library, started a cooking club, and even learned to become beekeepers. We're humbled by all the generous support, often from complete strangers.
You can support a public school teacher today by visiting DonorsChoose.org.
Paid non-attorney spokesperson paid for by the Sentinel Group. Attention military vets and current soldiers who served between 2002 to 2016. Have you or a loved one suffered hearing loss or tinnitus after serving or while serving in the U.S. Armed Forces? You may be entitled to compensation. 3M, the manufacturer of earplugs made for combat, recently paid the government $9.1 million to settle a False Claims Act case for knowingly selling these defective earplugs for over a decade. Specifically, the United States argued that the manufacturer knew their earplugs were too short for proper insertion into users' ears, and that the earplugs could loosen and therefore didn't perform properly or reduce noise the way they should have. If you or a loved one suffered hearing loss or tinnitus after serving or while serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, you need to choose the right legal team that has the experience, support staff, and resources to seek the most compensation for your injuries. Call the Sentinel Group now for more information and a free case review. Call 800-655-6458, 800-655-6458. That's 800-655-6458.
Thank you for listening to Viewpoints Radio, a production of Media Tracks Communications. If you enjoyed this broadcast, please support our show by subscribing, sharing it with a friend, and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can find more Viewpoints stories on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, and viewpointsonline.net. Also, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Viewpoints Radio. Coming up next week.
I don't think sex really matters. If you're interested in the field, I always say, try and get one of those ancillary jobs. Become a CNA, become a phlebotomist.
Male nurses aren't just employed to fill a quota. Their role is vital to overall patient care. Then,
I would hope he would still be alive,
What happens when the bully you wished would go away actually did? I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoint.